So continuing on with all of these iPhone comparisons, reviews, and all this good stuff, we're going to be taking a look at the iPhone 5C and seeing how it holds up in 2021. Now this is kind of a random phone, but I've also been pretty vocal about this device as well. I've called it probably one of the worst iPhones ever made, and looking at the whole entire phone landscape right now, I don't know if that's completely true, but it's definitely one of those devices that I think went from being one of like the worst iPhones ever made to being a very impactful iPhone for the life cycle and for just the thought process about this phone and what it meant for Apple and the phone industry as a whole. And I'm going to just probably take the first portion of this video talking about it because you all know how it looks like. The 4-inch panel on the front came out in 2013. It's probably like 8 years old at this point. It's turning 8 years. Lightning port, plastic on the back, all that good stuff. I'll get into the camera in a second. But when you look at this type of phone, right, let me get this out of the way first. The iPhone 5C, which came out in 2013, was Apple's first initiative as a whole of making a cheap budget phone or even dropping two iPhones at the same time. Apple released the iPhone 5C and the iPhone 5S on the same day. They announced both of them. So the 5S was the flagship type of device. It was everything Apple had at the time. They threw it onto a phone and it was their flagship. Whatever it was, $699, $799, whatever it was, that was their flagship phone at the time. And then you look at the iPhone 5C. This was Apple's cheap version of the iPhone 5S in a way, even though it was more so an iPhone 5. This was them kind of recycling those older parts, those older chipsets, and kind of selling them at the same time. Now, was it a great success? I don't think it was a crazy good seller at that moment because they never made like an iPhone 6C or anything. But here's the crazy thing. Apple did end up making an iPhone SE. They did end up making an iPhone XR, an iPhone 11, an iPhone 12, an iPhone 12 mini, an iPhone SE 2. These all the iPhones that I pretty much just mentioned are cheaper budget iPhones that Apple didn't have to make. They could have just kept selling these, super expensive phones, but it all initiated from the iPhone 5C in a way. Had we not had the iPhone 5C, we probably wouldn't have gotten Apple to make an iPhone SE, which was pretty much almost the same thought process as the iPhone 5C. It was probably even easier to make because they didn't have to re-engineer the back to put a plastic back on it and remove the aluminum and all that. It may have been a little bit more expensive to make, but they probably already had all these parts laying around. They just had to throw that chipset inside of it and call it the iPhone SE. And all those other phones, in my head when I think about that, it all originated from the iPhone 5C. I think a lot of people may say the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus because that was the first time we had the two different screen models. But when I look at the iPhone XRs, the 11s, the 12s, I don't think to myself like, oh, it's the screen differences. I think of it as a cheaper model versus the most expensive model. The same exact thing happened with the iPhone 5C. So that's kind of the thought process there. I think the iPhone 5C was very impactful. I don't think it's like iPhone 4 type of impact, but the thought process that went behind the iPhone 5C is still being seen in this day and age, even in 2020 and 2021, which we are in right now, obviously. So that was one thing I wanted to get out of the way. Obviously, like I said, this phone in the hand, it definitely doesn't feel like horribly cheap, for it being, like an 8-year-old phone. I wasn't expecting it to be super expensive, but it doesn't actually feel that bad. I think Apple did a pretty decent job for the feeling in the hand. I still think it was pretty expensive when it first came out, but it's totally understandable. They were trying different things, and I appreciate them for trying. Now, I said already kind of everything about this phone on the front and all that. You guys already know how that is. I will go ahead and hit on the camera though because I think it's very interesting. We still have that single 8 megapixel sensor on the back. We can shoot 1080p videos on it. There's nothing super crazy with it. No 4K, no 8K or anything like that. But at that time, it was pretty much just a recycled version of the iPhone 5. So it was pretty much using the same camera for the most part, which isn't a bad thing. I think the iPhone 5 had a pretty okay camera. As expected, it's not going to do anything super crazy. It's not going to make anybody switch from the iPhone 12 to this phone. But I think for the most part, it did an okay job and it did what it was supposed to do for the most part. So when it comes down to the whole entire camera setup on the back, it's really not that bad. On the front, we did have that 1.2 megapixel sensor. And I think more so than anything, the fact that this thing had the ability of, filming FaceTime calls, not filming, but doing FaceTime calls and all those different things. It really doesn't matter a crazy amount about the quality, but I will tell you this front camera isn't that great. It is very grainy. It's a 1.2 megapixel lens. You can film 720p videos on it if you want to, but for the most part, it's a pretty outdated camera. So when it comes down to that, even on the front and the back camera, you're really not doing yourself any favor picking this camera up. But again, it's a, important camera for the most part because the iPhone 5 had the same camera as well. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Software wise, we are completely outdated. This thing is not getting any more software updates. It is completely done. So that was pretty quick to hit on the software. Performance wise though, this is the moment I'll take a couple seconds on. So the Apple A6 chip, that's what it had inside of it, as well as 1 GB of RAM. Now this is what I'll tell you about the performance because it's really nothing to glorify the specific phone about, but when it comes down to it, iOS, this is just a testament to iOS. Apple does such a good job about their software that you can still pick up a phone that came out in 2013 and it really doesn't feel that old. Like, yes, completely, it feels like an old phone because it is an old phone, but it doesn't feel like a cheap device. It doesn't feel like a super unusable phone. Like, if I had to, I could probably still use this iPhone 5C and I would complain a lot about it probably, but I could get a majority of the things that I needed to in a day. I could probably get it done. A lot of the apps are still supported in the App Store, and that's a beautiful thing because this thing still got software updates for quite a bit of time, and the apps are still being updated in the App Store. So that's a huge advantage for this type of phone. So even though I can't maybe get the most recent version of certain apps, you can still download a lot of those apps from the App Store. So again, that in and of itself is another huge aspect of this specific phone. But again, in terms of the performance aspect, once you get those apps loaded and everything, it can be kind of like a glitchy, experience. It's definitely not going to be an extremely good experience or like it's going to be perfect. You're definitely not going to get that on this type of device. You're definitely going to be experiencing glitches, software issues, performance issues for the most part. But as I said before, as long as you aren't expecting the craziest type of performance, as long as you aren't expecting, everything to be perfect, then I think you're going to be okay. And especially if you're not comparing this type of performance from this phone against your iPhone 12 or your Galaxy S21 or anything, then you're going to be good for the most part from my head. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up. Now ending it off with the battery life, obviously I don't think anybody's using this phone anymore. I don't even think anybody made it this far in the video, to be honest, for this specific phone. If you did, comment something like a penguin or something and let's see how many of those get. But this thing had a 1510 mAh battery, and that's actually not a bad size battery for this type of phone. Obviously it's not good anymore, but it's really not like a super small battery for that time. And I've actually heard really good things about this specific battery at that time. At that time it actually had pretty decent battery life. So that pretty much covers it up for the most part. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, is the iPhone 5C still worth it in 2021? Well, this is what I'll tell you, okay? Let me just tell you some pros, because there are some pros about this phone. First of all, I don't think this phone feels like a super old phone. Obviously it is an old phone, but it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't look extremely bad. It looks still pretty, minimalistic. It looks pretty cute still. I think that's the best word I would give this phone. And I think that's the first time I've ever, said a phone looked cute. But the colors of this thing are great. This thing still has the lightning port and a headphone jack, which is also really great. We still have, lightning ports at this day and age. The camera setup on this thing is surprisingly okay. It's definitely not amazing, but it still takes photos. It still turns on. The software updates on this thing are done, but it doesn't mean it's like on an unusable version of software. iOS 10, which this thing ended off with, obviously isn't perfect, but it still gets some credit in some way because it was supported for quite a bit of time. And those are really pretty much the main things. Everything else is pretty much a con for this phone. The phone is definitely not that fast. The battery life isn't amazing. The performance isn't really like that great, as I stated. The front camera isn't that great. The way this phone looks isn't necessarily, up to today's standards. It's not getting any more software updates. The battery life isn't that great. And I could probably just keep going on, but it doesn't really matter because this phone, nobody's using it. And it's more so like it's almost like a collector's item. I think I said the iPhone 4 was more of a collector's item, but this phone really isn't that bad if I'm being completely honest. It's more of a collector's item in a way nowadays than anything else. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.